Hello everyone, I am Haunting Stories, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now, get comfortable and relax. My name is Meiser Oliver, and back in 2017, I decided to take my RV up to the remote stretches of the Kenai Peninsula in Alaska. I'd always been a fan of the great outdoors, fresh air, towering pines, and the kind of silence you can't find in the city. As a freelance photographer, I figured the solitude would do me good, maybe even help me capture that award-winning shot. I had recently gone through a rough patch, a breakup that left me questioning if my jokes were really as funny as I thought. Why did the Scarecrow win an award? Because he was outstanding in his field, I'd quip, only to be met with groans. Maybe my sense of humor needed a new audience. The drive was long but scenic. Snow-capped mountains loomed in the distance, and crystal-clear rivers snaked alongside the winding roads. When I finally reached the RV park near Kachemak Bay, it was nearly dusk. A handful of other RVs dotted the area, but they were spaced far apart, giving everyone a sense of privacy. After setting up camp, I decided to stretch my legs. I wandered toward the communal fire pit, where a few campers were gathered. An older couple, the Hades, greeted me warmly. "First time up here?" Mr. Hades asked. "Yeah, thought I'd try my luck photographing some eagles," I replied. "Be careful if you wander too far," Mrs. Hades warned. "People have gone missing around these parts." I chuckled, thinking it was a local's attempt at spooking the newbie. "Thanks for the tip. I'll make sure not to get lost." As the night wore on, we exchanged stories. I even tested out a new pun. "Did you hear about the guy who invented lifesavers? They say he made a mint." This time, I got a few genuine laughs. The next morning, I grabbed my camera and headed into the woods. The forest was dense, but beams of sunlight pierced through the canopy, creating a mosaic of light and shadow on the forest floor. I snapped photos of anything that caught my eye: a squirrel nibbling on a nut, a formation of birds overhead, the intricate patterns of moss on a fallen log. About an hour in, I stumbled upon something that made me pause: a makeshift campsite that looked abandoned. A tent was collapsed, and belongings were strewn about. Oddly, a coffee mug, half filled with rainwater, sat atop a log as if someone had just been there. "Hello," I called out. No response. I felt a slight unease but brushed it off. Maybe someone left in a hurry due to an emergency. As I turned to leave, I noticed something partially buried under leaves: a small notebook. Curiosity got the better of me, and I picked it up. Flipping through the pages, I realized it was a journal. The last entry read, "I think I'm being followed. Footsteps outside my tent last night. Must be the wind, but it feels off." A chill ran through me, not the metaphorical kind, but an actual cold breeze that seemed out of place on this mild day. I decided it was time to head back. On my way, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle in the bushes had me on edge. "Maybe the trees have eyes," I joked to myself, trying to lighten the mood. Or maybe I've watched too many horror movies. When I returned to the RV park, I noticed that the RV next to mine, a vintage Airstream, had its door wide open. I hadn't seen anyone come or go since I arrived. Approaching cautiously, I called out, "Anyone home?" Silence. Inside, the place was a mess. Dishes were broken on the floor, and the cushions were slashed. It didn't look ransacked, it looked frenzied, like someone left in a hurry. Or didn't leave at all. I backed out and went straight to the park's main office. The manager, a gruff man named Dale, looked up from his magazine as I entered. "Something wrong?" he asked. "Yeah, the RV next to mine looks like it's been trashed. The door was open, nobody's inside." Dale sighed. "That spot's been empty for weeks, shouldn't be anyone there." "Well, someone's been there, and I found an abandoned campsite in the woods." He frowned. "Best to mind your own business. The forest can be unpredictable." "Unpredictable? That's the best you got?" I retorted. He gave me a stern look. People come and go. Not my job to keep track. Frustrated, I left the office. Maybe I was overreacting, but something didn't sit right. I decided to do a little digging. I headed to a local diner, figuring small-town gossip might shed some light. Over a cup of coffee and a slice of pie, I struck up a conversation with the waitress, a friendly woman named Karen. "Has anyone gone missing around here lately?" I asked casually. She hesitated before answering. "Why do you ask?" I told her about the campsite and the RV. She lowered her voice. "There have been rumors. Hikers not returning, campers disappearing. The authorities chalk it up to getting lost, but locals think there's more to it." "Like what?" She glanced around before leaning in. "Some say there's a man living deep in the woods. Calls himself the Huntsman. They say he doesn't take kindly to outsiders." I raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like a bad fairy tale." "Believe what you want," she said, "but I'd be careful if I were you." On my way back to the RV park, I mulled over what she'd said. An isolated area like this could easily harbor a recluse. But a dangerous one? It seemed far-fetched. That evening, as I reviewed the photos on my camera, I noticed something odd in one of the shots. In the background, partially obscured by trees, was a figure. Zooming in, I could make out a man standing still watching me. He wore tattered clothing, and his face was shadowed by a hood. "Great, Harold. You've got your own personal Bigfoot," I muttered. I decided to report this to the local police. The station was small, manned by a single officer named Peterson. After showing him the photo, he shrugged. "Probably a hunter or another camper. In jeans and a hoodie. Doesn't look like typical hunting gear." He sighed. "Look, we get city folks up here all the time thinking they've seen something wild. Unless there's a crime, there's not much I can do." "People are disappearing," I pressed. "People get lost. It's a big wilderness. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have paperwork to do." Feeling dismissed, I returned to my RV. Night had fallen, and the park was eerily quiet. I locked the doors and double-checked the windows. Maybe I should have brought that baseball bat after all, I joked weakly. Around midnight, I awoke to a faint scraping sound against the side of the RV. My heart pounded as I strained to listen. Then came a whisper, barely audible, "Come out and play." I froze. This was no animal. Grabbing my phone, I dialed 911, but the call wouldn't go through. No signal, of course. I whispered a curse under my breath. The scraping continued, moving toward the door. I needed a plan. Looking around, I spotted a flare gun I kept for emergencies. Not ideal, but better than nothing. Taking a deep breath, I swung the door open and fired the flare into the darkness. The sudden light illuminated a figure standing a few yards away. His face was gaunt, eyes wild, and in his hand he held a crude, blood-stained knife. Without thinking, I slammed the door shut and bolted it. Adrenaline surged through me. Footsteps circled the RV, followed by a thud on the roof. "Seriously? This guy thinks he's in an action movie," I muttered, trying to steady my nerves. I remembered that the RV had a roof hatch. If he got in, I'd be trapped. I had to act. Grabbing my keys, I scrambled to the driver's seat. The engine sputtered before roaring to life. "Time to go," I said, flooring the gas pedal. The RV lurched forward, throwing me back slightly. From the side mirror, I saw the man lose his footing and tumble off the roof. As I sped toward the main road, something hit the windshield. A rock. Cracking the glass, but not shattering it. I didn't look back again. After what felt like an eternity, I reached a gas station that was still open. Bursting inside, I startled the clerk. "Call the police! There's a maniac out there!" I shouted. He grabbed the phone and dialed. Minutes later, Officer Peterson arrived. I recounted everything, my words tumbling out in a rush. He seemed skeptical, but agreed to follow me back. When we returned to the RV park, there was no sign of the man. The area around my RV was undisturbed. No cracks in the windshield, no marks on the door. "This is impossible," I insisted. "He was here." Peterson looked at me carefully. "Have you been drinking?" "What? No." Sometimes the isolation can play tricks on people. Frustrated and exhausted, I knew arguing was pointless. "Fine, but I'm leaving first thing in the morning." He nodded. might be best. That night, sleep eluded me. Every sound set me on edge. By dawn, I was packed and ready to leave. As I drove away, I saw Dale, the manager, watching me from his office window. For a moment, our eyes met, and I could have sworn he smirked. I decided to make one last stop at the diner for breakfast. Karen was there, surprised to see me leaving so soon. "Yeah, had enough adventure for one trip," I said. She leaned in. "Be careful on your way out, and watch for detours." I didn't think much of it until I hit the road. About an hour into the drive, signs indicated a detour ahead due to construction. Following the new route, I realized it led me deeper into the forest. "This can't be right," I said aloud. The road narrowed, and the trees grew denser. Suddenly, the RV sputtered and came to a halt, out of gas. Impossible. I filled up yesterday. Stepping outside, I felt the weight of the silence. No birds, no rustling leaves, just stillness. From behind a tree, the man emerged. But this time, he wasn't alone. Dale and Officer Peterson stepped out beside him. "What is this?" I demanded. Dale chuckled. "You couldn't leave well enough alone, could you?" Peterson added. "Should have minded your own business." Panic surged through me. "Why are you doing this?" "The huntsman needs his prey," the gaunt man whispered, a twisted smile on his face. I backed away slowly. "Look, I won't tell anyone. Just let me go." Karen's words echoed in my mind. "Watch for detours." Realizing this was planned, I knew I had to act fast. Without warning, I sprinted into the woods. Branches slapped my face, roots threatened to trip me, but adrenaline kept me going. Behind me, I heard them crashing through the underbrush. "You can't run forever," Dale shouted. Spotting a ravine ahead, I made a split-second decision. I slid down the embankment, landing hard but uninjured. A shallow cave caught my eye, a potential hiding spot. I squeezed inside, trying to quiet my ragged breathing. Footsteps approached the edge of the ravine. "Spread out. He couldn't have gone far," Peterson ordered. They moved away, their voices fading. I waited, counting the minutes. When I was sure they were gone, I emerged cautiously. The forest seemed endless, but I remembered that rivers often lead to towns. Listening carefully, I detected the faint sound of running water. Following it, I eventually reached a riverbank. Upstream, I saw a small bridge, and beyond that, the glint of metal train tracks. Hope surged within me. Staying low, I made my way to the tracks. In the distance, a train whistle blew. I hurried along the rails, waving frantically as the train approached. The conductor must have seen me because the train began to slow down. As it came to a halt, a worker leaned out. "What's going on?" "Please, I need help. There are people trying to kill me." He gestured for me to climb aboard. "Get in. We'll take you to the next station." Relief washed over me as the train pulled away. Safe, at least for now. At the station, I contacted the state police. This time, they took me seriously. An investigation was launched. Days later, authorities discovered that Dale, Peterson, and several others were part of a cult that hunted unsuspecting travelers. They operated in remote areas, making it easy to cover their tracks. Multiple bodies were found near the RV park and surrounding woods, victims who weren't as lucky as me. The huntsman, whose real name was Victor Hale, was a former survivalist with a penchant for violence. His motivations were rooted in a twisted belief that he was cleansing the world of outsiders. With the ring exposed, arrests were made. The RV park was shut down, and the area became the subject of national news. As for me, I returned home, grateful to be alive. My brush with death had been too close, too real. I later learned that Karen had tipped off the authorities anonymously, providing crucial information. Her subtle warnings had been her way of helping without drawing attention. In the end, justice was served, and the victims' families got the closure they deserved. The Cow Mountain Lights? They were just another mystery waiting for a rational explanation. That's what I told myself as I drove my RV up the winding roads of Pisgah National Forest. The thick trees closed in on either side. The air was crisp, and autumn leaves scattered across the path. There was a quiet stillness that made the world feel far away. I should have felt calm, excited even. But as the sun began to sink behind the distant ridges, leaving the forest bathed in shadow, I felt something else. Tension. Shaking it off, I parked the RV at the remote campsite I'd scouted. This was supposed to be a solo trip, a few days to get up close and personal with the Brown Mountain Lights, interview locals, take readings, and prove once and for all that the lights were nothing more than atmospheric conditions or optical illusions. I had all the gear I needed. High-resolution cameras, thermal scanners, EMF detectors, the works. I wasn't expecting to find anything supernatural, just an anomaly. And anomalies had explanations. But the moment I stepped out of the RV, a chill ran through me. The trees rustled softly, as if whispering some secret I wasn't meant to hear. "Focus," I muttered to myself, dragging my gear out and setting up the cameras, angling them toward Brown Mountain Ridge. I had a perfect view of the ridge from my campsite, miles away, but clear in the distance. That's where the lights were supposed to appear. By the time I was fully settled in, I was sitting outside the RV, bundled in a jacket, sipping coffee and staring out into the dark, waiting. The forest was eerily silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just stillness. Then, around midnight, I saw them. At first, they were faint, flickering, small orbs of light hovering just above the ridge. I squinted, adjusting the focus on my binoculars. There they were, three lights bobbing in the air like they were floating on an invisible current. I grabbed my camera, flipped the switch to start recording, but nothing happened. The lens remained black. The screen was dead. "What the hell?" I muttered, fiddling with the buttons. The camera was fully charged and brand new. It shouldn't have malfunctioned. I checked the battery, clicked it back into place, and tried again. Still nothing. Frustration surged through me. This was exactly what I had come here for. The lights, right there in front of me, and I couldn't even capture them. I stood up and grabbed my thermal scanner, but when I switched it on, the screen flickered once before going dark. "Come on," I whispered, trying to stay calm. The gear wasn't cheap, and none of it should have been failing. Yet it was, piece by piece. The lights danced on the ridge, growing brighter closer. My heart pounded. I wasn't scared, I told myself. Just annoyed. The logical part of my brain struggled to make sense of it. Maybe the electronics were glitching due to interference, some kind of electromagnetic field or something. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay steady. But the lights, those strange, pulsing orbs, kept moving, drifting toward me. The air turned frigid, so cold that I could see my breath misting in front of my face. A thin layer of frost began forming on the ground, on the RV windows, on my gear. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, my hands stiffening from the chill. It didn't make sense. The forecast had predicted a cool night, but nothing like this. I checked my phone's temperature app. 30 degrees Fahrenheit? Impossible. I scanned my surroundings, feeling the silence press in on me. Then I noticed the lights were no longer on the ridge. They were much closer now, floating just above the treetops, flickering like distant fireflies. But they were too large. Far too large. I watched, heart pounding, as they bobbed and weaved, their glow casting long shadows on the ground. I pulled out my phone to take a video. The screen flashed, then went black. It wouldn't turn on. Frustration boiled over. I slammed the phone down on the camping table. It bounced. I stood there, fists clenched, trying to keep my cool. This was why people got sucked into believing nonsense. Because technology failed at the worst possible moment. The lights weren't supernatural. There had to be an explanation. Maybe the cold was messing with the equipment, or some kind of atmospheric distortion. But then I saw the handprints. Small, faint handprints etched in frost on the RV window. They hadn't been there before. I knew that. I stared at them, my breath catching in my throat. They looked like the handprints of a child, no more than a few inches across, and they were slowly, gradually melting away in the cold. A prickling sensation crawled up the back of my neck. I turned to look at the lights, now hovering at the edge of the forest, close enough that I could make out their eerie bluish glow. They flickered in the trees, moving in slow, lazy circles, as if they were watching me, waiting for me. The rational part of my mind screamed that it was impossible. There was no way the lights could have traveled that fast. No way they could be this close. I'd seen videos, read reports. They were always distant, spectral, unreachable. But now they felt personal, as if they were beckoning me. I swallowed, my throat tight. Without thinking, I took a step forward. The cold deepened, pressing in on me from all sides. The frost crept up the sides of the RV, spreading like delicate veins. The temperature continued to drop. My breath came out in ragged gasps, and my vision blurred. The lights drifted deeper into the trees, flickering and glowing, moving in a pattern that felt deliberate, like they wanted me to follow. And I did. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands trembling as I made my way toward the forest's edge. The beam of light was weak, barely cutting through the darkness. I kept my eyes on the lights, feeling a strange pull in my chest, as if something was urging me forward. As I entered the trees, the world grew darker. The lights danced just out of reach, always a few steps ahead, their glow casting an ethereal shimmer on the twisted branches. The forest felt wrong, too quiet, too still. I checked my watch. 2 hours had passed. I hadn't even noticed. My legs ached, and a sinking feeling settled in my stomach as I realized I had no idea how far I'd wandered. The lights flickered again, brightening as they circled a large boulder ahead, then stopped, hovering there, motionless. I took a step closer, and that's when the hallucinations began. Shapes. Faint figures moving in the trees, shadows stretching unnaturally long. And there, between the branches, I saw faces. Pale, expressionless faces staring at me with hollow eyes. I blinked, and they were gone. Panic set in. I turned to leave, but the forest had shifted. The path I'd taken was no longer clear. Everything looked the same trees, the same twisting branches. The lights pulsed behind me, glowing brighter as if taunting me. I ran. My breath came in short, sharp bursts. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled through the underbrush, desperate to find my way back to the campsite. The lights flickered at the edges of my vision, but I ignored them. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Light, quick footsteps crunching through the frost behind me. I didn't dare look back. I ran faster, my flashlight flickering and dying in my hand. I broke through the tree line, gasping for air, and saw the RV ahead, a welcome sight. But the air around it was colder than ever. The frost was so thick on the windows that it looked like snow. And there, pressed against the glass, were more handprints. Dozens of them. I scrambled inside, locked the door behind me, and collapsed on the floor, panting. My entire body trembled with cold and fear. The lights were still out there. I could see them through the frosted windows, flickering in the trees, growing fainter as the night wore on. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. By dawn, they were gone. The temperature returned to normal, and the frost melted away. But I didn't feel safe. Not anymore. I packed up the RV and drove out of Pisgah National Forest, my hands still shaking on the steering wheel. I had come here to find an explanation, to debunk the Brown Mountain lights. But what I found was something else. Something I couldn't explain. And I knew, deep down, that the lights weren't just a phenomenon. They were something more. Something ancient, something dangerous, something that had almost taken me. I don't know what they wanted, but I'll never go back to find out. My name is Anton Mack, and I'm 32 years old. This happened along Paint Creek Scenic Trail in West Virginia during a trip I'd planned to reconnect with my art, and, frankly, myself. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape from the noise of the world, but instead, it became something I still can't fully explain. I had just come off a long relationship that ended in the kind of breakup that leaves you questioning everything. Your choices, your direction, your worth. Art was the only thing that felt steady, so I packed up my RV and hit the road. Paint Creek had come up in my research as a serene, lesser-known spot for nature lovers. I thought it would be the perfect place to spend a few days sketching and painting in solitude. When I arrived, the place was exactly as described: quiet, secluded, and hauntingly beautiful. The creek meandered through dense woods, its surface catching the sunlight like shards of glass. The leaves were just starting to turn, and the air carried a faint chill that hinted at the coming fall. I parked my RV near an old wooden bridge that crossed the creek. The bridge looked like it belonged in a ghost story, its weathered boards sagging slightly, but I couldn't resist its charm. I set up camp and spent the first day wandering the trails and sketching the landscape. The stillness was almost too perfect, but I chalked it up to being unused to this level of isolation. That night, I sat by the creek, working on a watercolor of the bridge as the sun dipped below the horizon. The forest around me grew darker, and the silence became oppressive. There were no birds, no insects, just the sound of the water trickling over rocks. I tried to focus on my painting, but a strange unease crept over me. It was like the air had shifted, growing heavier, colder. And then I heard it, a faint humming. It was soft at first, almost melodic, but it didn't seem to have a source. It wasn't coming from the creek or the woods. It was just there. I froze, my brush hovering over the paper. The sound grew louder, more distinct, and I realized it was a woman's voice humming a tune I didn't recognize. "Hello?" I called out, my voice breaking the stillness. The humming stopped abruptly, as if I had startled it. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. I told myself it must have been the wind or some trick of acoustics, packed up my supplies, and hurried back to the RV. The next morning, I woke to find my art supplies scattered across the ground outside the RV. My brushes were snapped in half, my paint spilled and smeared across the dirt. My first thought was that an animal had gotten into them, but there were no paw prints, no signs of disturbance, just the destruction itself. It didn't make sense. I spent the day trying to paint, but something felt off. The colors didn't look right. The lines felt shaky. Frustrated, I decided to take a break and explore more of the area. The old bridge drew me in again, its weathered planks creaking under my boots as I crossed. The creek below was impossibly still, its surface like a mirror reflecting the gnarled trees overhead. On the far side of the bridge, I noticed something etched into one of the trees, a name and a date carved deep into the bark. Margaret, 1873. The letters were uneven, as if done in haste, but what caught my attention was the feeling that swept over me as I touched the carving. A sudden, overwhelming sadness that didn't feel like my own. That night, the humming returned. I was inside the RV, trying to sketch, when I heard it again, drifting through the stillness. It was louder this time, unmistakable. The sound seemed to seep through the walls, wrapping around me like a cold embrace. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, my heart pounding. The air was icy, much colder than it had been earlier, and the forest was eerily quiet. The humming led me to the bridge, where the fog had thickened, shrouding the creek in an otherworldly glow. And then I saw her. She stood at the edge of the creek, her back to me. She wore a long dress, the kind you'd see in old photographs, and her hair cascaded down her back in dark waves. She was humming that same mournful tune, the sound weaving through the air like a spell. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. She stopped humming but didn't turn around. I took a hesitant step closer, and as I did, she began to dissolve, her form breaking apart like mist until there was nothing left but the fog. I stood there, frozen, unsure if what I'd seen was real or some trick of the light and my overactive imagination. The next day, I decided to drive into town to clear my head. At a small gas station, I struck up a conversation with the attendant, an older man who seemed to know the area well. "You're camping by the bridge, aren't you?" he asked when I mentioned Paint Creek. "Yeah, why?" He hesitated, then said, "People say it's haunted. They call her the Lady of Paint Creek. Story goes, she was abandoned by her husband during a harsh winter. He promised to come back for her, but he never did. She waited by that bridge until she froze to death. Now she haunts the creek, looking for people to join her. I laughed nervously, but his expression remained serious. "I'd avoid that bridge if I were you," he added, "especially at night." That evening, I couldn't stay away. Something about the Lady of Paint Creek drew me in like a moth to a flame. I set up my easel near the bridge, determined to capture her essence in my painting. As the hours passed and the sun dipped below the horizon, the fog rolled in again, and the humming returned. This time it was louder, more insistent. The air around me grew colder, and when I looked up, there she was, standing in the middle of the bridge. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her hollow eyes bore into mine. She didn't move, but the humming turned into words, a whisper that sent chills down my spine. "Stay with me." I backed away, but my foot slipped on the wet grass, and I fell. When I looked up, she was gone, but the feeling of her presence lingered, heavy and suffocating. I grabbed my supplies and ran back to the RV, locking the door behind me. That night, I dreamed of her. In the dream, I was standing on the bridge, staring down at the icy water. She appeared beside me, her hand cold as she touched my arm. "He left me," she whispered, her voice filled with sorrow. "They all leave." When I woke, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, just beyond the edges of my vision. I knew I had to do something to end this, to break her hold on me. On my final night at Paint Creek, I returned to the bridge with my sketchbook and paints. The fog was thicker than ever, and the cold seeped into my bones. I set up my supplies and began to paint, my hands trembling as I worked. I painted her story, the bridge, the creek, her lonely figure waiting in the snow. As I finished, the humming surrounded me, and she appeared again, this time closer. Her hollow eyes were filled with tears, and she reached out a hand toward the painting. I stepped back, unsure of what to do. "You're remembered now," I said, my voice breaking. "You're not forgotten." She stared at the painting for what felt like an eternity. Then she dissolved into the mist, her presence lifting like a weight from my chest. The forest grew quiet again, and for the first time I felt a sense of peace. I left Paint Creek the next morning, the painting tucked safely in the RV. It's one of my best works, but I've never been able to sell it. Something about it feels sacred, like it belongs to her. Even now I hear her humming in my dreams, but it's softer now, almost peaceful, as if she's finally found rest. And maybe, in a way, so have I. The road wound through the dense trees, snaking deeper into the heart of Low National Forest. The thick canopy above allowed only sparse sunlight to filter through, casting shadows across the narrow dirt road. I gripped the steering wheel of my RV, trying to shake off the gnawing sense of unease creeping up my spine. It had been 3 hours since I'd passed another vehicle. Solitude was the whole point, wasn't it? This trip was supposed to help me clear my head, to reconnect with myself after the divorce. I had spent the last few months in a fog, and this trip to Deadwood Creek was meant to be my escape, a test of independence. No ex-husband, no stress, just me in the wilderness. I needed this. At least that's what I'd been telling myself for the past 2 weeks. Deadwood Creek Campground wasn't listed on any mainstream maps, just a blip on an obscure site for hardcore campers who sought isolation. The campground had a reputation, but that was part of the appeal. I needed remote quiet, far away from anything that reminded me of what I'd left behind. But as I pulled into the clearing, past the sign half buried in moss that read Deadwood Creek, a shiver ran through me. The place was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you second-guess your decision to be alone. I parked the RV near a small, trickling creek. The only other vehicle was an old, beat-up camper a short distance away, nestled under the towering pines. It was empty, no sign of movement, no campfire. Good. I wasn't in the mood for socializing. I stepped out into the cool afternoon air and surveyed the site. The woods were thick, ancient. The ground was littered with pine needles, muffling the sound of my footsteps. A perfect retreat. I set up camp, unfolding my chair and setting my mug of tea beside me as I sat by the creek, listening to the soft gurgle of the water. It was peaceful, just as I'd hoped. But after a while, the peace felt off. Too still. The air grew heavy, pressing down on me, and the silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was oppressive. My mind wandered back to the stories I'd read online, the rumors about Deadwood Creek's dark history. This used to be a mining settlement during the gold rush, or so the tale went. Dozens of men had come to find their fortunes, but most found only death. Mysterious disappearances, bodies never recovered. Some say the men still haunt the place, bound to the land, working their endless shifts beneath the earth. I dismissed it at first, chalking it up to local folklore meant to spook tourists. But now, sitting alone in the fading light, the stories didn't seem so far-fetched. The wind rustled the trees, and I jumped at the sound. Get it together, Hannah, I thought, rolling my eyes at my own nerves. I hadn't come all this way just to scare myself into leaving. That's when I saw him. A man standing near the edge of the campground, just at the tree line, leaning against a tree. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a scruffy beard, his clothes worn and dirty as if he'd been out here for weeks. His gaze was fixed on me. I waved awkwardly, and he lifted a hand in response before slowly walking over. Didn't mean to spook you, he said, his voice easy, almost too casual. Didn't expect anyone else out here this late in the season. I wasn't expecting anyone either, I replied, forcing a smile. Just needed some time alone, you know. Yeah, I get that, he chuckled, though the sound didn't quite reach his eyes. I'm Rick, by the way. Been coming here for years. I nodded, unsure what to say. Rick had the look of someone who belonged out here, someone who knew the woods like the back of his hand. I didn't. Be careful out here, Rick said after a pause, his gaze drifting toward the woods. Deadwood Creek's got a history. Strange things happen when the sun goes down. My skin prickled at his words, but I forced myself to laugh. Let me guess. Ghost stories? Miners and all that? Rick's expression didn't change. Something like that. Just don't stray too far from your camp. He turned and walked back to his camper without another word, leaving me with a knot of unease in my stomach. That night, I couldn't sleep. The RV was silent, the temperature inside dropping faster than I had expected. I wrapped myself in blankets, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling creeping over me. Then the sound started. At first I thought it was the wind, but soon I realized it was something else. Faint at first, barely perceptible. A rhythmic clinking echoed from the direction of the creek. It sounded like tools. Mining tools. Pickaxes striking rock. I bolted upright in bed, my heart pounding. No, I had to be imagining it. This was what I had come here for. Solitude. But I couldn't shake the sound. It was growing louder, the metallic rhythm persistent, almost like a heartbeat. Grabbing a flashlight, I climbed out of the RV, my breath visible in the cold night air. The forest was a wall of darkness, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. The creek's rushing water was louder now, tumbling over rocks, and I could swear I heard voices, whispers carried on the wind. I swept my flashlight across the campsite, catching nothing but trees and the faint shimmer of water. Then I saw them. Figures, shadowy, half-formed shapes moving by the creek. Their outlines were faint but unmistakably human. They moved as if they were working, digging, swinging pickaxes in time with the clinking sound. My throat tightened as I realized they weren't there in the normal sense. They were translucent, faded. I stumbled back, my mind scrambling to make sense of what I was seeing. Ghosts? No, that was impossible. I backed toward the RV, my pulse racing. But as I turned, I nearly collided with Rick. Easy, he said, raising his hands. I saw your light, thought I'd come check on you. I couldn't find the words to explain what I had just seen, but Rick didn't need me to. He simply looked over at the creek and nodded, his face unreadable. They come out at night, the miners. Been here for over a century, trapped in their own hell. I swallowed hard, trying to suppress the rising panic. You mean you know about this? What is this place? Rick gave a half smile, though it was more sad than comforting. Deadwood Creek. These men came here to find gold, but all they found was death. Now they're stuck here, working the land forever. Some nights, they're just echoes. Other nights... He trailed off, but the implication was clear. On other nights, they weren't just echoes. I thought the desert would heal me. Red Rock Canyon was supposed to be a place to clear my head, to sit in silence, and let the vast, empty land take away the chaos of the last few months. I had lost everything. My wife, my job, and I needed something, anything, to remind me there was still some peace left in the world. Instead, it felt like I had driven into a nightmare. I parked the RV at the far end of the campground, as far away from the few other campers as I could get. I wanted solitude, to think, or maybe to stop thinking. I wasn't sure. The sun was setting as I stepped out, casting a deep orange glow across the red sandstone cliffs. It was beautiful. The kind of beauty that made you feel small, like the world was too big for you to matter. Maybe that was what I needed. I had been driving for hours with only the occasional crackle of the radio for company. The RV was old, creaking and groaning as I navigated the winding roads into the canyon. It had seen better days, much like me. As I stretched, a low rumble came from under the hood. "Great," I muttered, giving the RV a half-hearted kick. The engine had been acting up for days, but I figured I could deal with it later. I wasn't here for that. I was here to get away, to let the emptiness of the desert swallow me whole. That night, after I had settled in, I sat outside the RV, staring up at the stars. Out here, away from the city, the sky was incredible, clear, endless. But as the stars twinkled overhead, I noticed something strange. At first, I thought they were planes, blinking in and out far above the canyon. But then they moved too fast, too erratically. I leaned forward, squinting. There were 3 of them, glowing faintly blue, darting through the sky in impossible patterns. They weren't planes. I wasn't sure what they were. I stood up, craning my neck to follow their path as they circled overhead. One by one, they blinked out, and the desert was silent again. Just stars, I told myself, even though I knew that wasn't true. The next morning, I woke to find the RV's battery nearly dead. My phone, which I had left charging overnight, hadn't gained a single bar. I tried turning the engine over, but all I got was a dull click. My chest tightened. Being stranded in the middle of the desert wasn't part of the plan. I had enough food and water for a few days, sure, but the isolation was starting to feel less like a retreat and more like a trap. Milo's RV was parked a few spots down, his beat-up vehicle sitting in the shade of a large rock formation. He waved me over as I stepped out, a wide grin on his sunburnt face. "Morning," he called. "Beautiful day, huh?" I forced a smile. "Yeah, sure. Hey, you wouldn't happen to have jumper cables, would you?" Milo scratched his scruffy chin, then shook his head. "Sorry, friend, but I can give you a ride into town later if you need help. It's not too far." I thanked him, but something about Milo unsettled me. Maybe it was how relaxed he seemed, like this place wasn't bothering him at all. As I stood there, he tilted his head toward the canyon walls. "You see the lights last night?" he asked. I froze. "Yeah, what were they?" He shrugged like it was nothing. "Oh, those things. People talk about them all the time. Could be military, could be something else. No one really knows, but they've been around as long as I've been camping out here." I laughed nervously. "Something else, huh?" Milo smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "People say they're not from this world. I don't know about that, but sometimes they follow you. Just don't go too far out at night, and you'll be fine." I forced another laugh, but my stomach churned. Milo's tone was too casual, too accepting. I thanked him again and went back to my RV, trying to shake the feeling that I was missing something important. The day dragged on, the heat baking the ground beneath my feet. I spent the afternoon hiking a short trail near the campground, trying to clear my head, but the vast emptiness only made me feel more alone. I kept thinking about the lights, how they had moved, how they seemed to watch me. That night, they returned. I was sitting outside again, nursing a warm beer and staring at the sky when I saw them. 3 faint blue lights hovering over the canyon. This time, they were closer. Too close. They flickered almost playfully, darting back and forth like they were searching for something. I stood up, my heart pounding. It didn't make sense. Nothing about this place made sense. I backed toward the RV, never taking my eyes off the lights, but as I reached for the door, the lights blinked out, gone, just like that. A cold breeze swept through the canyon and I shivered. It was too quiet. No wind, no insects, nothing. Just the dead, suffocating silence of the desert. Then the RV lights flickered once, twice, and went dark. My chest tightened as I stumbled into the RV, fumbling for the flashlight. I clicked it on, but the beam was weak, barely cutting through the darkness. The electrical panel was dead and my phone wouldn't turn on. Every piece of technology I had was failing, and I had no idea why. A sudden knock on the door made me jump. "Chris, you okay?" It was Emily, the hiker I'd met earlier that day. She had pitched her tent nearby, planning to stay for a few nights before heading out. I opened the door, trying to hide my panic. "Yeah, just some electrical issues," I said, forcing a smile. "Everything's dead. I'm guessing the battery's shot." Emily frowned, glancing back at her tent. "That's weird. My phone's dead too, and my flashlight keeps flickering." Her voice was calm, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She felt it too, the strangeness in the air, the weight of the silence. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Do you think it's the lights?" Milo told me about them earlier, said people disappear sometimes. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my breathing steady. "Disappear?" Emily nodded, her gaze drifting toward the canyon. "Yeah, it's mostly stories, but you seemed pretty convinced." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air felt thick and heavy, as if the desert were closing in on us. I wasn't sure if I believed in Milo's campfire tales, but the lights, they were real, and they weren't natural. "We should get out of here," Emily said, breaking the silence. "I don't like this." "I can't," I replied. "My RV won't start." She hesitated, then nodded. "Mine either. I tried earlier, but it's completely dead." We stood there, staring at each other, the weight of the situation sinking in. Something was wrong with this place. The lights weren't just an oddity, they were doing something, affecting everything around us, and we were stuck, miles from any help. "We'll wait till morning," I said, trying to sound confident. "Maybe it's just a temporary glitch. We'll figure it out." Emily didn't look convinced, but she nodded and headed back to her tent. I locked the RV door behind her, though I wasn't sure what good it would do. That night, I barely slept. The silence was oppressive, like a blanket wrapped too tightly around me. Every creak of the RV, every gust of wind made my heart race. I kept waiting for the lights to come back, to hover outside my window, but they didn't. Instead, I woke sometime in the early hours, drenched in sweat, my head pounding. I sat up, blinking in the darkness. Something was wrong. I glanced at my watch. It was 4 a.m., but that didn't make sense. I'd checked the time just moments ago, and it had been midnight. Where had the hours gone? I stumbled outside, feeling disoriented. The air was cooler now, the desert's chill settling in. The stars were out, but there was no sign of the lights. My mind was foggy, as if I had been dreaming. But the dust on my boots told me I had been walking. But where? And why? Panic surged through me. I couldn't remember. Hours were missing, and I had no idea what had happened. The lights were playing with us, toying with our sense of reality. I ran toward Emily's tent, calling her name, but when I got there, she was gone. Her tent was empty, her pack still there, but she was nowhere to be found. "Emily!" I shouted, my voice echoing off the canyon walls. Nothing. The only sound was the wind. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But the lights, the missing time, it all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. We weren't alone. I sprinted back to my RV, slamming the door behind me, and tried the engine again. To my shock, it roared to life. The headlights flickered on, and I didn't hesitate. I jammed the gear shift into drive and tore out of the campsite, gravel kicking up behind me as I sped down the winding canyon road. I glanced in the rearview mirror for just a second. I saw them, the blue lights, hovering in the distance, watching me leave. I didn't stop driving until I hit the outskirts of Las Vegas. The neon lights of the city felt like a lifeline. But even then, as I pulled into a gas station, my hands shaking, I couldn't shake the feeling that the lights were still out there, waiting. And I wasn't sure if I had really escaped at all. My name's Robinson, and back in 2016, I took my RV up to the Uncompahgre National Forest in Colorado to get a bit of solitude. I figured a few days in the quiet woods was what I needed after a brutal stretch at my job. That and a chance to unwind and catch up on some reading I'd been putting off for too long. The campsite was perfect. A little slice of isolation in a pine grove near a mountain stream. There weren't any other campers around, just the way I liked it. After parking, I set up a small fire pit, rolled out a camp chair, and opened a cold beer. It wasn't until dusk that I noticed the first strange thing. Hanging from a tree just outside the edge of the camp was a bundle of what looked like animal bones tied together with rough twine. I remember squinting at it, trying to figure out if I was looking at some kind of decoration or a hunter's marker. I shrugged it off, figuring it was something left behind by previous campers. Maybe someone with an odd sense of humor. But as night settled in, there was a strange tension in the air, a feeling like the forest was aware. That's the best way I can put it. And then there was a sound, a low, distant snap of a branch. Now, I'd done plenty of camping, so I knew the usual sounds: animals rustling, branches falling, even the distant howl of a coyote or two. But this wasn't that. It felt deliberate, calculated, like someone was creeping around my campsite, observing me. I called out, maybe hoping it was another camper who had just happened upon the spot. Silence. Not even the crickets joined in. Figuring it was probably my own nerves getting the best of me, I settled back in my chair, trying to brush it off. Maybe I even laughed a little, reminding myself I was out here to relax. But then, just as I was starting to unwind, another noise cut through the night. This time, it was closer, and it didn't sound natural. It was a low, whispering voice somewhere in the trees. I couldn't make out the words, but it had a strange rhythm, almost like a chant. I froze, listening harder, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. A chill crept up my spine, and I cursed myself for not bringing anything stronger than a pocket knife. Then there was a flash of movement. I turned my flashlight toward the trees and saw him. A man, standing just outside the ring of light. He was gaunt, dressed in layers of old, tattered clothes that looked like they hadn't seen a washing machine in years. His face was twisted in a wild grin, eyes wide with something that looked too intense to be curiosity. I called out, asking if he was lost. But he didn't answer. He just stared, that grin plastered on his face. I started getting that sinking feeling in my stomach, realizing I wasn't dealing with some lost hiker. This guy was here for a reason, and I had a strong feeling it had nothing to do with friendly campfire company. Without a word, he stepped back into the darkness, vanishing from sight, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts and that damn silence. I glanced around, debating if I should pack up and leave. But the road back was rough, and I wasn't eager to navigate it in the dark. So I went back into the RV, locking the door behind me. I grabbed a flashlight and a steak knife, the best I could manage at the time. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak, every rustle outside set me on edge. Hours seemed to pass with that quiet tension hanging thick in the air. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard scratching at the door. Not loud, but enough to make the hair on my arms stand up. I held my breath, my hand gripping the flashlight tightly, ready to hit anything that came through. Then the door handle rattled. I don't remember deciding to open the door, but somehow, I did. And there he was, standing right there. So close I could smell him, a rank mix of sweat and earth. His eyes darted around the inside of the RV before locking onto me. He didn't say anything, but that twisted grin returned. I forced out some words, telling him to leave, that I'd call the cops if he didn't back off. Still, he just stood there, staring. Then, in the most casual way you could imagine, he reached into his coat and pulled out a rusty hunting knife. The kind that looked like it had seen more than just a few animals. "Nice place you got here," he rasped, his voice as rough as gravel. I tried to shut the door, but he wedged his foot in, the grin widening. Panic started to claw at me. I shoved the door as hard as I could, finally managing to get it closed, hearing his foot crunch. His scream of pain echoed through the trees, and it was the most human sound I'd heard from him all night. I'd like to say I felt bad, but survival has a way of dulling empathy. It went quiet after that. I stood by the door, my heart pounding, flashlight in one hand and that ridiculous steak knife in the other, just waiting. A minute later, I heard footsteps circling the RV. Slow, deliberate, as if he was daring me to come out. Then I smelled smoke. I ran to the tiny window at the back and saw flames licking up the side of the RV, catching on the dry pine needles he'd piled against it. The guy had lit my RV on fire, probably thinking he could smoke me out like some kind of animal. And judging by the wild look in his eyes earlier, he wasn't doing this for kicks. This was personal. I grabbed a blanket, threw it over my shoulder, and kicked the emergency exit open, rolling out into the dirt. The flames were climbing, and as I scrambled to my feet, I saw him, standing in the shadows, holding something in his hands. It was my backpack. Must have grabbed it while I was distracted. But it wasn't just the backpack. Hanging from his other hand was something that made my blood run cold. A severed hand. Limp. Dripping. The nails were caked with dirt, and I recognized the wristband on it. It was from a kid I'd seen camping with his family a few miles down the trail earlier that day. My mind reeled. I wanted to turn, to run, but I couldn't. The twisted satisfaction on his face as he held that hand was paralyzing. I don't know what kind of person it takes to do something like that, but I knew I didn't stand a chance if I tried to reason with him. He tossed the hand to the ground between us, as if he was offering me some kind of twisted trophy, and in that moment, I knew. This wasn't just about scaring me. This guy was a predator. Someone who'd done this before, and planned to do it again. I backed up slowly, and he matched me, step for step, that knife glinting in his hand. I could feel my pulse hammering, knowing that if I made one wrong move, he'd close the gap in an instant. My options were narrowing by the second. Then, I remembered the emergency flare in my pocket. I fumbled it out, not daring to take my eyes off him. With a quick flick, I sparked it to life. The bright red light flared up between us, casting long shadows across his face. For the first time, he looked uncertain. It was just enough. I sprinted, hurling the flare behind me, hoping the light and heat would buy me a few seconds. I tore down the trail, lungs burning, not daring to look back. I didn't stop running until I saw the lights of a ranger station up ahead. I stumbled in, gasping, barely able to get the words out. By the time the rangers got to my campsite, my RV was a charred skeleton, and there was no sign of him. All they found was a pile of bones, some still smoldering, and a tattered piece of cloth with a name stitched into it. Later, they told me he'd been living out in those woods for years, scavenging from campers, picking them off one by one. They called him the Hermit of Uncompahgre. A ghost story turned real. As for me, I've never been back, and I don't plan to. Got it? Here's the paragraph with only spelling and syntax corrected. No changes to content or phrasing beyond what's needed for standard English. The Beast of Voidfen Creeper. I've always prided myself on being the guy who keeps his cool no matter what. That's why I was leading this trip deep into the Blackwater Ridge Manala National Forest. It was supposed to be a challenge, and I was ready for it. I'd hiked dozens of trails tougher than this, and I wanted to prove that to my old friends, especially Elaine, who couldn't even set up a tent without breaking a sweat. But there's something about being miles away from civilization, surrounded by nothing but endless trees, that starts to mess with your head. As soon as we arrived, I could feel it. Not that I'd let anyone see that, of course. "Linda, you got the map?" I called out as we packed up the last of the gear. "Yep, but I doubt we'll need it with you in charge." She winked, slinging her backpack over her shoulder. I grinned. She knew how to stroke my ego, one of the things I loved about her. Elaine, on the other hand, was struggling to adjust the straps of his pack. His face was already red, and we hadn't even started walking yet. "Can we take it slow, guys? I haven't done this in a while." "Sure, Elaine. We'll pace ourselves," I said, trying to hide my impatience. Sarah, ever the practical one, rolled her eyes but said nothing. She was the scientist of the group, the one who'd be lecturing us about rare plants and ecosystems halfway up the trail. She was here more for research than the hike, but I knew she could handle herself. We hit the trailhead late in the morning, the sun already filtering through the thick canopy above. The first couple of miles were easy enough, well marked, a few uphill climbs, nothing too rough. Elaine fell behind pretty quickly, as expected, but we made enough stops to let him catch up. By the time we reached our first campsite, the air had a heavy, oppressive feel. The sun dipped below the trees, casting long, eerie shadows across the forest floor. The dense foliage seemed to swallow up the light, leaving us in a strange twilight. We set up camp without much trouble, although Elaine complained about the weight of his gear the whole time. Our tents were cheap, sure, but they did the job. Sarah was meticulous, making sure her tent was perfectly aligned with the slope of the ground. "It's going to rain tomorrow," she said almost as an afterthought. "Clear skies right now," I pointed out, but she just shrugged. Night came quickly, faster than I expected. By the time we had the fire going, the forest had gone almost completely silent. No birds, no insects, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustling of leaves. It was weird. I'd been in plenty of forests, but something about this one felt off. "You guys hear that?" Elaine said, glancing around nervously. "Hear what?" Linda asked, stirring the pot of stew she'd made over the fire. "No, it's like, I don't know, like something moving out there." I paused, listening. At first there was nothing, but then I heard it too. Soft, distant, and low. A growl, almost like the sound of a heavy breath. "Coyotes," I said, trying to sound confident. "Nothing to worry about. They're probably more scared of us than we are of them." But I saw Sarah tense up. She was studying the woods beyond the firelight, her face set in concentration. I didn't like that. When I turned back to Elaine, he was pale, fidgeting with his hands. "Maybe we should keep the fire going all night," he said. "Relax, Elaine. We're fine. Nothing's coming near us." But the truth was, something felt off. Even I couldn't shake it. The second day was rough. The terrain started to get steeper, and the trail was less defined. Elaine was falling behind more often, and Linda's enthusiasm was starting to wane. We pressed on, but there was a growing sense of unease that none of us could shake. Halfway through the day, we found something that made me stop in my tracks. A deer carcass, ripped apart and strewn across the trail. Blood, dark and congealed, soaked into the ground around it. Whatever had killed it wasn't hunting for food. It looked like something had torn it apart just for the hell of it. Elaine gagged, turning away. "What the hell?" Linda knelt beside the body, her face a mix of curiosity and horror. "This wasn't a bear. Look at the size of these tracks." I crouched down next to her. She was right. The prints were huge, human-like but twisted. Something was wrong with the feet. Long, deep claw marks gouged into the dirt. I glanced at Sarah. Her face was pale, her brow furrowed in deep concern. "This isn't normal," she whispered. "We should go back." The confident TJ who could handle anything suddenly felt a sliver of doubt crawl up his spine. "Nah, we're fine," I said, brushing it off. It's just some animal. We'll be careful. Let's keep moving. But I knew, we all knew, something was out there, watching. That night was worse. We set up camp earlier, just as the sky began to darken. The wind picked up, carrying a strange metallic scent, something foul. The air felt heavy, thick with unexplainable dread. The fire crackled low, throwing flickering shadows on the tents, but none of us felt the comfort of its warmth. We sat closer than usual, even Elaine, who had barely spoken since we found the deer. I sat there gripping the handle of my knife, trying to tell myself I was just being paranoid. But when I looked at the faces of my friends, I knew I wasn't the only one feeling it. "Do you hear that?" Sarah said suddenly, her voice barely a whisper. We all went silent, listening. At first there was nothing but the wind in the trees. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, closer this time. "What the hell is that?" Elaine's voice cracked, his eyes wide with fear. "It's just an animal," I said again, though I wasn't sure who I was trying to convince anymore. But it wasn't. We all knew that. This was something different, something wrong. From the shadows beyond the firelight, something moved. It was fast, so fast I barely caught a glimpse. But I saw enough. A tall, hunched figure just beyond the ring of light, watching us. Its eyes glowed bright and unnatural. Linda stood up. "I'm gonna check it out." "No," Sarah hissed, grabbing her arm. "Stay here. Don't be stupid." But Linda, always fearless, shook her off and stepped into the darkness. "Linda!" I shouted, grabbing my flashlight. I scanned the darkness, then I saw it. A tall, gaunt creature with dark, leathery skin and glowing red eyes. It lunged, Linda screamed. We ran, and we never saw her again. Big Bear Lake in California. My name is Martin Carenza, and back in 2017, I decided to take my RV out to a quiet spot near the Mount Hood National Forest in Oregon. My wife was usually my camping partner, but she caught a bad flu, so I went solo. I figured I could manage a few nights alone, read a few books and fish. My idea of the perfect downtime was no phone service, no one around, and a lake where the fish didn't mind biting. I parked the RV in a secluded spot right near a lake, and after a few hours of quiet, I felt my shoulders drop. The only sounds were the soft rush of the wind in the pines and the occasional splash in the water. I set up a few fishing lines on the edge of the lake and grabbed a beer from the cooler, sinking into my camping chair as the evening settled in. On the first night, I thought I heard something outside the RV around midnight. Just a few crunches on the gravel, like someone was walking. I figured it was an animal, a deer maybe, though I still got up and looked outside, finding nothing. Just shadows and the silent forest. I brushed it off. This wasn't my first solo camping trip, and I was used to hearing noises now and then. The second night, though, I heard it again. This time, the crunching was slower, deliberate, not the kind of sound an animal makes. I was lying in bed, trying to read by flashlight, but the noise made me put down the book. I listened for a few moments, then quietly got up and peered out the small RV window. Standing near the edge of the clearing was a tall man. He was in his 50s, I'd guess, with gray hair and clothes that looked too clean for camping. He stood completely still, his face tilted up as if he was sniffing the air. It wasn't exactly the type of scene I expected to see on a solo camping trip, and my first thought was that he was probably a ranger. I decided to step out and ask if he needed help. As I opened the door, he turned slowly toward me, and I noticed his lips twitching into what could have been a smile, or maybe a snarl. I felt my stomach tighten, but I ignored it. "Hey there," I called. "Can I help you with something?" He didn't answer. He just kept staring at me with that fixed, unnerving look, his lips parting a little like he was tasting the air. There was something off about him, but I tried to keep things normal. You camping out here too?" I asked, trying to lighten the mood. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was scratchy like he hadn't used it in a long time. "Got lost," he muttered, his words almost a whisper. "Been out here, looking for a place to stay. Well, There's a town about 20 miles south. I could show you the way in the morning." His eyes shifted, and for a moment I thought he'd agree. But then he looked down at my fishing gear lying on the ground by the water. "I haven't had fish in a long time," he said, his voice barely audible. It was then that I noticed his hands. They were covered in what looked like dried blood. My heart started to race, but I forced myself to stay calm. I have some food in the RV," I said, inching back toward the door. "You're welcome to some if you're hungry." He took a step forward, still smiling that strange half-snarl of his. "I don't eat canned food," he said, as if that settled things. I nodded slowly, my hand reaching for the door handle. "All right, then. Well, I'd best get some sleep." Before I could turn around, he took another step toward me, closer now, and his voice dropped to a raspy whisper. "What are you doing out here alone, friend?" There was something chilling in the way he said friend, as if it meant the opposite. I swallowed hard, keeping my voice steady. "Just camping. I like the quiet." He tilted his head, examining me with a strange intensity. "You're lying." My pulse hammered in my chest, but I forced a casual smile. "No, I'm just a regular guy out for some peace and quiet." His eyes narrowed, and he took another slow step forward. I knew that I needed to get back inside, lock the door, and maybe even drive off if he kept pressing closer. "All right," I said, keeping my voice as calm as I could. "You take care now." I turned, and that's when I heard him sprint forward. Instinct kicked in, and I threw myself into the RV, slamming the door just in time to hear his fists pounding against it. The door shook, the thin walls rattling as his voice grew louder. Angry. "Let me in, friend," he screamed, his voice twisted with rage. "You think you're safe in there?" I scrambled back, locking myself in the small bathroom, listening as he tried the handle, then started circling the RV, tapping on each window, trying each latch. I pressed myself against the wall, holding my breath, hoping he would get bored or think better of it. But he didn't. For hours, he lingered outside, muttering to himself, his voice carrying words I couldn't quite make out. Occasionally he would laugh, a low, mirthless sound that sent chills down my spine. When I finally dared to peek out through a crack in the bathroom door, I saw his face inches from the window, his eyes scanning the inside of the RV as if he were hunting something, or someone. Eventually he moved back, retreating into the forest as the first light of dawn broke over the trees. I waited a full hour, my heart still hammering, before I worked up the nerve to unlock the door and step outside. I thought he was gone. But as I moved to collect my fishing gear, I found a makeshift camp hidden in the trees nearby, littered with rotting food, empty cans, and something else. Bones. Small bones. Some picked clean, others still covered in dried blood. When I looked closer, I saw something scrawled on a piece of bark near the edge of his camp. The words were carved in deep, jagged letters. "One more to go." That was when I knew he hadn't just been lost. He had been hunting. And that night, I had been the one he had chosen. I stumbled back from the trees, my eyes darting around the quiet, misty forest. Every crackle of a branch sounded too loud, too close. I grabbed my fishing rod, not even caring about the tackle box I had left on the shore. I just needed to get out. I sprinted back to the RV, threw myself inside, and started the engine. The tires kicked up gravel as I tore out of the clearing. I could barely keep my hands steady on the wheel, gripping it so hard my knuckles went white. The forest blurred past me as I drove, trying to leave every trace of him behind. I didn't slow down until I hit the main road. It was only then that I let myself breathe, glancing over my shoulder to make sure he wasn't somehow trailing me. When I finally pulled into the nearest town, I parked outside a diner, its lights casting a soft glow in the early morning. I didn't care about looking disheveled or that I was the only customer there before dawn. I just wanted to be around people. The waitress took one look at me and brought over a cup of coffee without even asking. "Rough night?" she asked, eyeing the scrapes on my arms from where I'd bolted through the trees. I nodded, trying to steady myself enough to take a sip. You could say that, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked at me for a moment, then leaned in, speaking quietly. You're not the first. There have been stories of strange folks around those woods. Folks who don't belong, who are hunting something. I felt the chill as her words echoed what I'd seen. What do you mean, hunting? I asked, needing to hear someone else say it out loud. She lowered her voice even more. People go missing now and then. Then, as I left the diner, I saw it. A small, crumpled piece of bark wedged into my windshield wiper, jagged letters carved into it. I know where you are. I left that town and never looked back. My name's Mark Alwyn, and in the summer of 2021, I decided to take an RV trip to Wind Cave National Park, a vast and rugged place in South Dakota known for its extensive cave system and remote, empty landscape. I had recently gone through a rough breakup, and this trip was supposed to be my way of getting away from it all, finding a bit of peace and maybe a little solitude. The plan was simple. Drive my RV into the depths of the park, away from the handful of other campers, and just disconnect for a few days. Maybe see some wildlife, make a few bad jokes with a couple of beers, and catch up on sleep. The breakup had left me in a kind of fog, like I was missing parts of myself. So yeah, this trip was supposed to be therapy. I'd always been an early riser, so the first morning, I brewed a pot of coffee, grabbed my camping stove, and headed outside to set up breakfast. The morning was beautiful. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like the world has decided to leave you alone for a while. I set up my camp chair near a small clearing and pulled out some eggs and bacon, already imagining the scent filling the crisp air. That's when I saw him. A lanky guy in a worn leather jacket stood by the tree line, watching. I gave him a casual nod, trying not to think much of it. After all, it was a public park. He had every right to be there. But he didn't nod back. He just stood there, fixed in place. A sense of unease crept in, but I brushed it off and focused on my breakfast. The guy didn't move for a good 5 minutes. Finally, when I glanced over again, he was gone. I figured maybe he was out hiking early and had happened to stumble upon my camp. But the fact that he'd been watching in total silence lingered in my mind. I made a mental note of it, finished my breakfast, and decided to take a small hike before it got too warm. There were trails around here that led to the lesser-known parts of the park, the kind that didn't have tourists bustling about with cameras. I wanted quiet, but the hike didn't turn out to be what I'd hoped. About a mile down the trail, I had that prickling feeling you get when someone's behind you. I stopped, listening, to the wind rustling through the trees, the birds, the distant sound of running water. And then I heard it, footsteps. I froze, scanning the trees. That's when I saw him again, the man from the tree line, following me at a distance. He was just close enough that I could see the glint of metal at his hip. He was staring right at me, making no attempt to hide. "Hey," I called out, raising a hand. "Lost?" No answer. Just those dark, expressionless eyes fixed on me. He didn't seem fazed or embarrassed about being caught. If anything, he looked more determined. For a second, I thought maybe he was a ranger. Maybe about to tell me I'd wandered off a marked trail or something. But he didn't have a uniform. No park badge. Just that jacket, which looked like it had seen a few too many nights out in the cold. I turned back, quickening my pace without looking over my shoulder again. But the hairs on my neck told me he was still there, shadowing my every step. By the time I reached my RV, my pulse was racing, and all that serene, peaceful escape I had come for felt like a joke. I locked myself inside and stood by the window, peering through the blinds. At first, there was nothing, and I started to think maybe I'd overreacted. But then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw him, standing right at the edge of my campsite, perfectly still, staring at my RV. His stance was unnervingly relaxed, like he was waiting for me to come back out. The day passed in tense, silent hours. I didn't dare leave the RV, and he didn't move from his spot. Every so often, he'd walk a slow circle around my sight like a predator stalking its prey. At one point, I called out to him again, hoping to break whatever strange, silent game he was playing. "Hey man, if this is some kind of joke, it's not funny. You need help or something?" Nothing. Not a word. Just that same unnerving stare. As the sun began to dip below the trees, painting the landscape in long, dark shadows, I felt a pang of dread. I'd heard stories about people going missing in national parks, stories that usually didn't end well. The ranger station was miles away, and I had no cell service out here. I was on my own, and so was he. The tension broke when he finally moved again, striding right up to the RV door. My heart slammed in my chest. I locked eyes with him through the small window, and for the first time, I saw the faintest hint of a smirk on his face. A knife glinted in his hand. I grabbed the nearest thing within reach, a cast iron skillet, which I had to admit wasn't exactly a weapon of choice. But it was all I had. My mind raced with plans to escape. The keys were in the ignition, but he was between me and the door. I could ram the skillet against the window, scream, try to scare him off. But something told me he wasn't the type to get scared. Then, with a suddenness that made my skin crawl, he started banging on the RV door. Each thud was like a countdown telling me he'd break in, and once he did, there'd be no one to stop him. I thought back to my childhood, my dad telling me that if someone ever broke in, you never let them get you to a second location. You fight, no matter what. I had to do something. But he'd come prepared, scared, hadn't. The banging stopped, and everything went quiet. Too quiet. I held my breath, like listening for any sign of him moving, anything at all. Then a soft click. He was picking the lock. Before I had time to react, the door flung open. The skillet in my hand felt absurdly small. He took a step inside, his face inches from mine, that smirk never faltering. "You don't have a weapon, do you?" His voice was low, mocking. I swung the skillet as hard as I could, landing a blow to his shoulder. He staggered but barely flinched. He lunged toward me and I dodged, but only just. The knife sliced through my jacket sleeve, a hot sting following close behind. I didn't have time to think. I bolted out of the RV, taking off into the darkness with nothing but my instinct driving me. Branches clawed at my face, rocks tore at my shoes, but I didn't stop. Behind me, I heard him, his footsteps, heavy and fast, closing the distance. I threw a glance over my shoulder and nearly tripped. He was right there, barely 10 feet away, his knife glinting in the pale moonlight. There was only one thing left to do. I veered off the trail, leaping down a rocky incline that led deeper into the woods. I heard him stumble, cursing, and then he was after me again, crashing through the brush like a bull. My lungs burned, my legs screamed for mercy, but I couldn't stop. Then, I saw it, a small clearing ahead bathed in moonlight, and just beyond it, the silhouette of a cabin. I didn't know if it was occupied or abandoned, but I ran for it, praying someone was inside. I reached the door, pounding on it with the last of my strength. "Help, please!" The door creaked open, revealing an older man. His face was shadowed and rough, like he'd been living out here a long time. He took one look at me, then past me, at the man in pursuit. And without a word, he pulled me inside and slammed the door shut. The two of us stood there, listening. The footsteps stopped outside. Silence hung heavy in the air. And then, a slow, scraping sound along the cabin's walls. The old man handed me a rifle, his face set in grim determination. We didn't exchange words. There was no need. We waited. Tense. Breathless. The footsteps circled the cabin. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The old man looked at me, nodded, and whispered, "He'll be back. Back. But not tonight. He always comes back." When I finally made it back to my RV at dawn, my hands were shaking. The man was gone, leaving nothing but footprints in the dirt. But I knew he'd return. As I pulled away from the campsite, I caught one last glimpse of the old man's cabin disappearing behind the trees, his words echoing in my head. The old man was right. This wasn't the end. My name is Nolan Rowan, and back in 2017, something happened to me near Banff, Alberta. Being a member of the Cree Nation, I've always felt more at home among the trees than anywhere else. I suppose that's what I get for preferring the company of squirrels over people. Less drama, more nuts. That summer, I decided to take a solo hiking trip into the Rockies. It wasn't my first time trekking alone. I'd been navigating those trails since I was old enough to tie my own boots. Friends used to joke that I could find my way out of a forest faster than they could find their cars in a parking lot. I always laughed it off, telling them that trees don't move. But good luck convincing a parking lot to stay the same for 5 minutes. I set out early one morning, the sun just beginning to peek over the mountain peaks. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and earth. My backpack was loaded with the essentials: water, trail mix, a map, and a sense of overconfidence that could rival a teenager's. If arrogance were a compass, I'd never get lost. About 3 hours into the hike, I reached a fork in the trail. The left path led toward a well-known lookout point frequented by tourists and amateur photographers. The right path was less traveled, overgrown with brush and barely visible. Naturally, I chose the path that screamed "bad idea," louder than a horror movie soundtrack. I thought to myself, what's the worst that could happen? A question that, in retrospect, is the universal cue for things to go south. As I pushed through the dense foliage, the forest grew quieter. The usual sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling seemed to fade away. It was as if the woods were holding their breath. I shrugged it off, attributing it to the thickness of the trees muffling the sounds. Besides, silence is golden, right? Or at least, that's what I told myself to ignore the growing unease in my gut. After another hour, I stumbled upon a small clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated cabin, weathered by time and swallowed by vines. It wasn't on any map I had, and trust me, I checked. Curiosity got the better of me because, really, who wouldn't want to explore a creepy abandoned cabin in the middle of nowhere? If life were a horror movie, I'd be the guy who investigates the strange noise in the basement. I approached the cabin cautiously. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, threatening to give way. The door was ajar, revealing darkness inside. I took out my flashlight and stepped in. The interior was sparse. A broken table, a rusted stove, and walls adorned with claw marks. Nice decor, I mumbled. Real homey. As I scanned the room, my light caught something on the floor. Tracks. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Too big to be a wolf, too clawed to be a bear. I knelt down to get a closer look. The print resembled that of a massive feline, but was distorted, as if whatever made it had more toes than it should. Well, that's not in any field guide, I muttered. A sudden noise outside made me jump. A rustling of leaves followed by a low, guttural sound. I froze, every muscle tense. Great. Probably just a raccoon auditioning for a jump scare, I thought, attempting to steady my nerves. I slowly stood up and peered out the grimy window. At first, I saw nothing but the swaying branches. Then movement caught my eye. Emerging from the tree line was a creature unlike any I'd encountered. It moved with the stealth of a mountain lion, but stood taller than a grizzly bear on its hind legs. Its body was sleek yet muscular, covered in dark, matted fur. The head resembled that of a wolf, but with elongated jaws and too many teeth crammed into its maw. Its eyes were fixed on the cabin. On me. Okay. Time to go, I whispered, my heart pounding like a drum solo. I backed away from the window, careful not to make a sound. My mind raced. The cabin had one door and no back exit. A classic design flaw when you're trying to escape unidentified monsters. I cursed under my breath, wishing I'd taken that left path to the scenic overlook instead. The creature began circling the cabin, its footsteps heavy yet eerily controlled. I could hear its claws scraping against the wooden exterior. Desperate, I looked for anything that could serve as a weapon. My eyes landed on a rusted fire poker near the stove. Better than nothing, I thought, grabbing it and positioning myself near the door. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. The silence was deafening. I held my breath, straining to hear any sign of movement. Then, with a force that shook the entire cabin, the creature slammed into the door. The hinges groaned but held. "That's one sturdy door," I noted wryly, though I doubted it could withstand another hit. The second impact shattered the doorframe, wood splintering as the door flew inward. The creature stood in the doorway, its form filling the space. Up close, the stench hit me, a mix of wet dog and decaying flesh. "Ever heard of a bath?" I quipped, raising the fire poker defensively. It lunged at me, swiping with a massive, clawed paw. I dodged to the side, feeling the air ripple where its claws had been. Adrenaline surged through me. "So this is how I die," flashed briefly in my mind, but I pushed the thought away. I wasn't about to become the punchline of my own bad joke. I swung the fire poker, striking the creature's arm. It let out a howl, not of pain, but of irritation, like I'd merely poked it with a stick. "Well, that didn't work," I muttered. It advanced again, and I knew I had to think fast. Spotting a window to my left, I made a split-second decision. I threw the fire poker at the creature's face, not to harm it, but to distract it for a precious moment. As it raised an arm to deflect the makeshift missile, I bolted toward the window. Without hesitation, I leaped through the glass. The world became a blur of shattered shards and whipping branches as I tumbled onto the ground outside. Ignoring the cuts and the sting of fresh wounds, I scrambled to my feet. Behind me, the creature roared in frustration. I sprinted toward the tree line, adrenaline fueling my legs. The dense forest that once felt like home now twisted into a labyrinth of obstacles. Every root and fallen branch seemed intent on tripping me up. Nature's not on my side today, I thought grimly. The sound of heavy footsteps crashed behind me. The creature was in pursuit, and it was fast. Too fast. Ahead, I spotted a steep incline, a rocky hill that led down to a river. Better than becoming lunch, I decided. Without breaking stride, I flung myself down the slope. Rocks shifted underfoot, and I half ran, half slid toward the rushing water below. Behind me, the creature hesitated at the top, perhaps uncertain of the unstable terrain. Reaching the riverbank, I didn't pause to consider the temperature or the current. I plunged into the icy water, the shock stealing the breath from my lungs. The river's flow was swift, pulling me downstream. I surfaced, gasping, and caught a glimpse of the creature pacing along the bank, unable or unwilling to follow. "Guess you don't like swimming," I sputtered, a flicker of relief mingling with the cold. The river carried me around a bend, and the creature disappeared from sight. After what felt like hours, but was probably mere minutes, I managed to grasp an overhanging branch and pull myself to shore. Shivering, I took stock of my situation. I was miles from civilization, soaked and weaponless, with an unidentified predator on the loose. "I've had better days," I joked weakly. I needed to get back to the main trail. If I could find it, I could follow it back to the trailhead and my truck. With any luck, the creature would lose interest. But given my track record, luck wasn't exactly my middle name. As I made my way through the forest, the daylight began to fade, the temperature dropped, and the sounds of the nocturnal forest emerged. Every rustle and snap put me on edge. Maybe I should have taken up knitting instead, less chance of being eaten by yarn. Then, in the distance, I heard voices. Human voices. Pushing through the underbrush, I emerged onto a campsite where a group of hikers had set up tents around a fire. They looked up in surprise as I stumbled into their midst, bedraggled and bleeding. "Whoa, buddy. You okay?" one of them asked, standing up. "Depends on your definition of okay," I replied. "But if you've got a phone or a way out of here, I'd be forever grateful." They ushered me to the fire, offering a blanket and hot coffee. I explained what had happened, omitting the more unbelievable details. "Something big chased me," I said. "Could be a bear, or something else." One of the hikers, a lanky guy with glasses, frowned. "There aren't any bears reported in this area," he said, "and certainly nothing that matches that description." "Well, whatever it was, it's out there, and it's not friendly," I insisted. An older woman in the group nodded slowly. "I've heard stories from the locals," she said. "Legends of creatures that guard these woods. Most people dismiss them as myths." "Great. I'm being hunted by a myth," I sighed. "Just my luck." They agreed to help me get back to the trailhead. As we packed up their camp, a chilling howl echoed through the trees. The group exchanged uneasy glances. "Tell me that was your stomach," I joked weakly to the lanky guy. We moved quickly, sticking together. The path back was eerily quiet, and the darkness pressed in around us. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see glowing eyes staring back. Suddenly, a scream pierced the night. One of the hikers at the rear was gone. We spun around, shining flashlights into the forest. The beam caught a glimpse of the creature dragging the unfortunate hiker into the shadows. Panic erupted. "We have to help him," someone shouted. "With what?" I snapped. "We have no weapons, and that thing is not messing around." A horrifying shriek cut through the air, followed by a sickening silence. We stood frozen, the reality sinking in. "We need to keep moving," the older woman urged. "Now." We broke into a run, the path twisting under our feet. The sounds of pursuit crashed behind us, branches snapping, heavy footfalls gaining ground. Ahead, I spotted the glimmer of lights. "The parking lot! There!" I shouted. We burst out of the tree line, racing toward the vehicles. Fumbling with keys, we piled into the nearest car. The engine roared to life, and we sped away just as the creature emerged from the woods, watching us with predatory eyes. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town. At the local ranger station, we reported what had happened. Authorities organized a search party, though their skeptical glances made it clear they doubted our story. Days later, news broke that a hiker had been found mauled near the area we described. Officials attributed it to a bear attack, cautioning people to stay on designated trails. I knew better. Bears don't walk on two legs or have faces that blend the worst features of wolves and nightmares. But there was no point in arguing. In the aftermath, I did some digging. Local legends spoke of a guardian beast, a protector of the land angered by trespassers. They called it the Mia, named after the wild spirit of the mountains. Whatever it was real. And it was out there. My name's Ronald Kalin, and in 2017, I took my RV to a spot near Kenai Fjords National Park in Alaska. I'm not a survivalist or a wilderness guide. I'm an accountant from Atlanta who got fed up with numbers and paperwork. So I figured I'd finally hit pause on life and spend a couple of weeks camping. I drove all the way from Georgia, chasing the quiet, thinking Alaska would be the kind of place where I could just sit back with a beer and let my brain go blank for a while. When I parked the RV in this isolated area just outside the national park, it felt perfect. Not a single person around. I was miles from the nearest campground, let alone a neighbor, and to me, that was ideal. I was setting up my little oasis when I noticed a couple of things off the bat that didn't sit right. The first was the absence of wildlife. I mean, it's Alaska. Bears, moose, the whole lot. But around me, nothing. No scat on the ground. No broken branches from animals passing by, just silence, except for the faint rustling of leaves. By day 3, I'd settled into a good routine. Coffee in the morning, a short hike in the woods, then I'd grill up whatever canned meal I felt like eating. It was on one of these afternoon hikes that I stumbled across an old, half-collapsed wooden cabin. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The door was hanging off the hinges, and there was this strange smell around it. A mix of rotting wood and something sharper, kind of metallic. I figured it was rust from some old tool or metal scrap inside, so I brushed it off. But something didn't sit right with me. There were bits of clothing scattered around the area. Shirts, old jackets, even a pair of jeans. It looked like they'd been there for years, frayed and faded by the weather. I don't know why, but I felt a chill. Part of me thought I should turn back, but another part, maybe the accountant side that just needs answers, thought I should go inside and take a look around. The interior was even worse. Dirt was caked on every surface. The floor was covered in what looked like animal bones. Small ones, maybe birds or rabbits. And that same metallic smell was stronger now. I looked up and noticed something hanging from the ceiling. It was a hook, the kind you'd see in butcher shops. It didn't belong there, not in the middle of a forest. But it was there all the same, swaying slightly as if disturbed by some breeze that I couldn't feel. At that point, I decided to head back to the RV. I figured it was best to keep my distance from whatever strange things were left behind in that place. But when I stepped out of the cabin, I could have sworn I heard footsteps, faint and dragging behind me. I stopped, turned around, and waited. But nothing appeared. The forest around me was dead silent again. Back at the RV, I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I'd just psyched myself out. That night, though, I barely slept. I had brought a shotgun with me just in case of wildlife, and I kept it by my side. Every little noise outside felt amplified, like something was creeping around just out of sight. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Morning came, and I felt a bit stupid. I decided to spend the day fishing in a small creek I'd passed earlier, trying to distract myself. But even out by the water, that eerie silence remained. No birds chirping, no fish biting, just the occasional snap of a twig somewhere behind me, which I tried my best to ignore. The thought that maybe I wasn't alone out here crept up more than once, and I started questioning if maybe I'd made a mistake coming out this far. Then, later that evening, as I was grilling up some fish, I caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye, just on the edge of the tree line. I squinted, trying to make out what I was seeing, but all I could make out was a figure. A man, maybe, crouching low, watching me. He was dressed in what looked like layers upon layers of dirty clothes, all torn up and mud-streaked, his face partially obscured by a tangle of hair. He was still as a statue, just watching. I shouted out to him, trying to play it cool, asking if he was lost, but he didn't respond. Instead, he slowly ducked back into the trees, disappearing without a sound. Every instinct told me I needed to pack up and leave. But stubborn as I was, I convinced myself that he was probably just some harmless drifter. I thought if I ignored him, he'd go away. The next night, things escalated. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a scraping noise coming from outside. It was a slow, dragging sound, like something was being pulled along the side of the RV. I froze, gripping the shotgun tighter than ever, listening. The scraping moved along the length of the vehicle, stopping right outside the window next to my bed. I didn't dare look out. For a solid hour, I just lay there sweating, listening to the faint scratching on the metal. Then, silence. I finally drifted off, hoping I'd imagined the whole thing. But in the morning, when I stepped outside, there were muddy handprints smeared along the side of the RV. That was enough for me. I started packing up my stuff, thinking I'd head back to the main road and find a new spot, maybe closer to a town. But as I loaded the last of my things, I spotted him again, standing a few yards away by a cluster of birch trees, staring at me with this blank, almost curious expression. He was holding a long, rusty blade, one that looked like it had seen far too much use, and his clothes were even filthier than before. I didn't think. I raised the shotgun and aimed at him, shouting for him to stay back. He just smiled, a slow, unsettling grin, and started to walk toward me, dragging that blade along the ground. I fired a warning shot into the air, hoping he'd take the hint. But he kept coming, unfazed, picking up speed. At that moment, I knew I couldn't just wait around. I ran back into the RV, locked the door, and fired up the engine. But the man lunged at the driver's side window, slamming his fist against it, that rusty blade scraping along the glass. I stomped on the gas, swerving as he clung to the side, banging on the window, his face pressed against it with that same terrifying smile. The RV lurched forward, finally throwing him off balance, and I sped down the dirt road, not daring to look back. After what felt like an eternity, I hit the highway, my heart still pounding. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station miles away, where I could finally breathe. The police in Anchorage were polite but skeptical. They took down my statement and checked out the muddy handprints on the RV, but all they could offer was a half-hearted promise to patrol the area. They didn't even sound like they believed me. Later, out of curiosity, or maybe just out of fear, I did some digging. I found a couple of stories about a man named Gideon who was known to lurk in those woods. Rumored to be some kind of deranged hermit who'd lived there for decades. People said he'd lost his family in a hunting accident and went off the deep end, becoming obsessed with cleansing the forest of outsiders. My name's Ronald Kalin, and in 2017, I took my RV to a spot near Kenai Fjords National Park in Alaska. I'm not a survivalist or a wilderness guide. I'm an accountant from Atlanta who got fed up with numbers and paperwork. So I figured I'd finally hit pause on life and spend a couple of weeks camping. I drove all the way from Georgia, chasing the quiet, thinking Alaska would be the kind of place where I could just sit back with a beer and let my brain go blank for a while. When I parked the RV in this isolated area just outside the national park, it felt perfect. Not a single person around. I was miles from the nearest campground, let alone a neighbor, and to me, that was ideal. I was setting up my little oasis when I noticed a couple of things off the bat that didn't sit right. The first was the absence of wildlife. I mean, it's Alaska. Bears, moose, the whole lot, but around me, nothing. No scat on the ground. No broken branches from animals passing by, just silence, except for the faint rustling of leaves. By day 3, I'd settled into a good routine. Coffee in the morning, a short hike in the woods, then I'd grill up whatever canned meal I felt like eating. It was on one of these afternoon hikes that I stumbled across an old, half-collapsed wooden cabin. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The door was hanging off the hinges, and there was this strange smell around it. A mix of rotting wood and something sharper, kind of metallic. I figured it was rust from some old tool or metal scrap inside, so I brushed it off. But something didn't sit right with me. There were bits of clothing scattered around the area. Shirts, old jackets, even a pair of jeans. It looked like they'd been there for years, frayed and faded by the weather. I don't know why, but I felt a chill. Part of me thought I should turn back, but another part, maybe the accountant side that just needs answers, thought I should go inside and take a look around. The interior was even worse. Dirt was caked on every surface. The floor was covered in what looked like animal bones. Small ones, maybe birds or rabbits, and that same metallic smell was stronger now. I looked up and noticed something hanging from the ceiling. It was a hook, the kind you'd see in butcher shops. It didn't belong there, not in the middle of a forest. But it was there all the same, swaying slightly as if disturbed by some breeze that I couldn't feel. At that point, I decided to head back to the RV. I figured it was best to keep my distance from whatever strange things were left behind in that place. But when I stepped out of the cabin, I could have sworn I heard footsteps, faint and dragging behind me. I stopped, turned around, and waited. But nothing appeared. The forest around me was dead silent again. Back at the RV, I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I'd just psyched myself out. That night, though, I barely slept. I had brought a shotgun with me just in case of wildlife, and I kept it by my side. Every little noise outside felt amplified, like something was creeping around just out of sight. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Morning came, and I felt a bit stupid. I decided to spend the day fishing in a small creek I'd passed earlier, trying to distract myself. But even out by the water, that eerie silence remained. No birds chirping, no fish biting, just the occasional snap of a twig somewhere behind me, which I tried my best to ignore. The thought that maybe I wasn't alone out here crept up more than once, and I started questioning if maybe I'd made a mistake coming out this far. Then, later that evening, as I was grilling up some fish, I caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye, just on the edge of the tree line. I squinted, trying to make out what I was seeing, but all I could make out was a figure. A man, maybe, crouching low, watching me. He was dressed in what looked like layers upon layers of dirty clothes, all torn up and mud-streaked, his face partially obscured by a tangle of hair. He was still as a statue, just watching. I shouted out to him, trying to play it cool, asking if he was lost, but he didn't respond. Instead, he slowly ducked back into the trees, disappearing without a sound. Every instinct told me I needed to pack up and leave. But stubborn as I was, I convinced myself that he was probably just some harmless drifter. I thought if I ignored him, he'd go away. The next night, things escalated. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a scraping noise coming from outside. It was a slow, dragging sound, like something was being pulled along the side of the RV. I froze, gripping the shotgun tighter than ever, listening. The scraping moved along the length of the vehicle, stopping right outside the window next to my bed. I didn't dare look out. For a solid hour, I just lay there sweating, listening to the faint scratching on the metal. Then, silence. I finally drifted off, hoping I'd imagined the whole thing. But in the morning, when I stepped outside, there were muddy handprints smeared along the side of the RV. That was enough for me. I started packing up my stuff, thinking I'd head back to the main road and find a new spot, maybe closer to a town. But as I loaded the last of my things, I spotted him again, standing a few yards away by a cluster of birch trees, staring at me with this blank, almost curious expression. He was holding a long, rusty blade, one that looked like it had seen far too much use, and his clothes were even filthier than before. I didn't think. I raised the shotgun and aimed at him, shouting for him to stay back. He just smiled, a slow, unsettling grin, and started to walk toward me, dragging that blade along the ground. I fired a warning shot into the air, hoping he'd take the hint. But he kept coming, unfazed, picking up speed. At that moment, I knew I couldn't just wait around. I ran back into the RV, locked the door, and fired up the engine. But the man lunged at the driver's side window, slamming his fist against it, that rusty blade scraping along the glass. I stomped on the gas, swerving as he clung to the side, banging on the window, his face pressed against it with that same terrifying smile. The RV lurched forward, finally throwing him off balance, and I sped down the dirt road, not daring to look back. After what felt like an eternity, I hit the highway, my heart still pounding. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station miles away, where I could finally breathe. The police in Anchorage were polite, but skeptical. They took down my statement and checked out the muddy handprints on the RV, but all they could offer was a half-hearted promise to patrol the area. They didn't even sound like they believed me. Later, out of curiosity, or maybe just out of fear, I did some digging. I found a couple of stories about a man named Gideon, who was known to lurk in those woods. Rumored to be some kind of deranged hermit who'd lived there for decades. People said he'd lost his family in a hunting accident and went off the deep end, becoming obsessed with cleansing the forest of outsiders. The road into the Boundary Waters was a frozen ribbon through a sea of snow, the trees standing like silent sentinels under heavy blankets of ice. The RV's heater hummed steadily, but even that couldn't keep the biting cold out. I was deep into the wilderness now, the place I'd picked to spend a week. Just me, the frozen lake, and the stillness of winter. I'd been coming to places like this for years, ever since the accident. The solitude was the only thing that seemed to quiet my mind. This time, I was here to ice fish, maybe snap a few photos for my nature blog, but mostly, I was here to prove to myself that I could still handle it. The cold, the isolation, the memories. I pulled the RV to a stop by a small frozen lake I'd scouted on a map. It was miles away from the nearest town, completely off the grid, just how I liked it. I stepped out into the icy air, my breath fogging in front of me as I took in the sight. The lake was a vast white expanse, the ice thick enough to drive on, stretching out into the distance where the trees disappeared into a blur of white. Perfect. I set up camp quickly, parking the RV near the shoreline and gathering my gear for ice fishing. The cold had a way of creeping into your bones out here, but I didn't mind. I was used to it. I grabbed my auger, trudged out onto the ice, and started drilling a hole. The sound of the blade biting into the ice echoed through the stillness, sharp and harsh against the quiet of the wilderness. Then I heard it. A deep, low rumble that seemed to come from beneath the ice. I paused, the auger still in my hands, and listened. The sound came again, a low, distant vibration like the ice shifting far beneath the surface. I'd heard ice groan before. Anyone who spends enough time in the cold knows the sound of a lake adjusting to the freeze, but this was different. It was deeper, longer, almost like something was moving down there. I brushed it off and kept drilling. By the time the hole was ready, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow. I set up my fishing gear, lowered the line into the icy water, and settled in to wait. The cold crept in quickly, even through my heavy coat, but I was prepared for it. I'd done this 100 times before, and the routine was comforting. But that sound, the rumble beneath the ice, kept creeping back into my thoughts. As night fell, I lit a small fire near the shore, the flames flickering weakly against the chill. I sat by the fire, staring out at the frozen expanse of the lake. The stars were starting to appear in the clear sky above, bright and distant. Then I saw it. A light, faintly flickering and coming from beneath the ice. At first, I thought it was a reflection, maybe the moonlight hitting the ice in just the right way. But as I watched, the light moved slow and steady, as if something was drifting beneath the surface. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but it was still there, faint and regular, like a lantern swaying beneath the ice. I stood, my heart pounding in my chest, and walked toward the lake. The light seemed to pulse, growing brighter for a moment, then dimming again, always moving, always just out of reach. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a trick of the light or a reflection of something from the sky. But deep down, I knew better. There was no one else out here, no one who could be moving under the ice. The rumble came again, louder this time, vibrating up through the soles of my boots. I took a step back, suddenly feeling exposed out there on the open ice. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and I turned back toward the RV, my mind racing, the light, the sound. Something wasn't right. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I went back out onto the lake, determined to make sense of it all. The sun was barely up, and the cold was more biting than ever. As I walked, I glanced back toward the hole I'd drilled the day before. Something was off. There, by the edge of the hole, was a long, jagged crack running across the ice. The crack hadn't been there yesterday. It snaked out in a jagged line, as if something had pressed up from below. I knelt down, running my gloved fingers along the crack, feeling the cold seeping through the ice. The surface felt thin, too thin for the middle of winter. Then I noticed something glinting just beneath the ice. I leaned closer, peering into the crack. At first, it looked like a piece of metal, rusted and sharp, lodged beneath the surface. I reached into the cold water, pulling it free. It was old, jagged, like part of a machine. But there was no reason for it to be here. The nearest road was miles away, and there hadn't been any mining or construction in the area for years. The metal was strange, sharp and smooth, like it had been cut clean. As I held the piece in my hand, the rumbling came again. Louder now, closer. I stood quickly, scanning the lake. The light was back, faint but steady, moving beneath the ice, closer than before. My pulse quickened, and I felt a cold sweat break out under my coat. Something was down there. Something was moving. I backed away from the crack, my mind racing. The metal, the light, the sound. It all pointed to something beneath the ice. Something unnatural. But what? The stories I had heard over the years about strange things beneath the frozen lakes, about disappearances and creatures buried deep in the ice, came flooding back. I'd always dismissed them as nonsense, campfire stories to scare the newcomers. But now, standing there in the middle of the frozen lake, I wasn't so sure. I needed answers. Later that day, as I was gathering more firewood, I came across an old ice fishing shack near the edge of the lake that looked abandoned. But there were fresh footprints in the snow leading up to the door. Curious, I approached, knocking lightly before pushing the door open. Inside, I found an older man hunched over a small stove, warming his hands. His face was weathered, his beard streaked with gray, and he looked up at me with tired eyes as I stepped in. "Didn't expect to see anyone out here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The man grunted, his eyes narrowing. "Not many come this deep into the wilderness." I hesitated. "I've been hearing strange sounds under the ice, and I saw a light last night, moving beneath the surface. Do you know anything about that?" The man's expression darkened. He turned back to the stove, staring into the flames. "You shouldn't be out on that lake," he said quietly. "There are things beneath the ice, things that shouldn't be disturbed." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart pounding. The man sighed, rubbing a hand across his face. "There's an old mining operation under that lake, abandoned long ago. They were digging deep, too deep. Some say they woke something up down there. Ever since, strange things have happened. People go missing. The ice breaks when it shouldn't. And that light, it's not the only thing that moves down there." A chill ran down my spine. "What's under there?" The man shook his head. "I don't know. But I've been coming out here for years, and I've seen enough to know when something isn't right. The lake's alive. It's watching you." That night, the light beneath the ice returned, brighter than before, pulsing like a heartbeat. I watched from the RV, my breath fogging up the window, as the rumbling beneath the ice grew louder, more insistent. I knew I couldn't stay. Whatever was beneath the lake, it was waking up. I packed my gear quickly, throwing everything into the RV. But as I started the engine, the ground beneath the RV began to tremble. The rumbling was almost deafening now, vibrating up through the frozen earth. I glanced out toward the lake, and my blood ran cold. The ice was cracking, long fissures spreading out from the center of the lake. And then in the distance, the surface of the ice exploded upward, a massive shape breaking through. I only caught a glimpse, something dark and enormous, sliding beneath the ice again, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. But it was enough. I floored the gas pedal, the RV lurching forward as I raced away from the lake, the sound of cracking ice echoing behind me. The road was a blur, my heart pounding in my chest. But even as I drove, I could still feel it, the weight of something massive beneath the surface, watching, waiting. When I finally reached the main road, the rumbling stopped. But the memory of that thing beneath the ice stayed with me. I'll never forget it. The way the light pulsed, the way the ice cracked, as if it were alive. I left the boundary waters behind, but a part of me knows I'll never truly escape it. Some things should stay buried. And whatever's beneath that lake, it's not finished yet. That's it for today's tale from Haunting Stories. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, The Haunting Stories thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the haunting awaits your return.